Slava Isusu Christu, glory to Jesus Christ. I'm Father Jack Custer, rector of St. Michael's Cathedral in Passaic, New Jersey. And it's been a while since we've done an adult faith formation live stream. And that's because I've been preparing a whole new series, and I'm a little out of my depth here. I wanted to introduce our parishioners and those friends who are joining us from God knows where online to the very, very rich, but very, very overlooked treasury of Catholic Church teaching regarding the issues that we tend to box off separately as political or social or not really religious. And there are all kinds of voices, there have always been all kinds of voices that try to tell the church, you should stay out of politics, just stick to spiritual things. Except if you talk to God for any length of time at all, you'll hear him talking about life and how to live it, and human beings and how to treat them. If you've spent any time on this earth at all, you've had to make moral decisions. And those moral decisions have serious consequences for our eternal salvation. There is no way we as individuals can avoid dealing with the questions that that come up in the world of politics and government. And because we are active members of the societies in which we live, we have an obligation to contribute what we know and what we believe to the common discussion. I'll say more about that down the line, but I want to start in maybe a relatively safe place, just to ease us into this slowly. I would like to start with an encyclical written by Pope Leo XIII. Like all encyclicals, it's known by the first couple of words in its Latin name. This one is called Rerum Novarum, of new things. It's about the modern world, and it's about some things that in 1891, the church was confronting officially for the first time. A little bit of background. The encyclical is dated May 15th, 1891. Let's look at the 19th century for just a moment. The 19th century began with Napoleon. There were revolutions in 1848 in Sicily, France, Italy, Germany, Austria. It was the revolution of 1848 under Kossuth Lajos that produced the Kingdom of Hungary as the second half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The revolution got the Hungarians more recognition in the Austrian Empire. And 1848 is also the date in which Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto. 1870 saw the consolidation of Italy and Germany as nation states for the first time. They had previously been divided into all kinds of kingdoms, princedoms, duchies, and so on, and also the establishment of a secular, very secular, republic in France. So we've moved out of the world in Europe of Catholic monarchies, or at least monarchies with established religions. That's new. Meanwhile, in the 19th century, we saw the invention of the steam engine, interchangeable mechanical parts, and as a result of better and stronger tools, huge growth in the field of textile manufacturing, steel milling, and mining. As a result of this new technology, we also have steamships. In 1891, most of the people in Europe and in North America still lived on farms. England's the exception there. England got so industrialized that in 1891, 72% of the English population lived in manufacturing cities. In the United States, only 28% of the population in 1891 lived in cities. And that's going to change radically in the early 20th century. And it's going to change primarily because of industrialization and especially immigration. All of these changes created a huge change in the way people lived. As people were attracted to mining and milling jobs, as people left the land and moved to the cities, the way they supported themselves changed. More and more of the population became wage earners, working for owners of mines, mills, factories. And this period saw a marked change in the disparity between the lives of the rich and the lives of the poor. Suddenly there were a whole class of very ostentatiously wealthy people, these entrepreneurs and industrialists, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Rockefellers, folks like that, who have enormous fortunes. And contrast that to the subsistence, the utter poverty of wage earners. Pope Leo XIII looks around at this new situation and talks about the prevailing moral degeneracy. What does he mean by that? He means the emptying of the countryside so that more and more families were no longer self-sufficient farmers, but were now dependent on wage labor in overcrowded cities. He means the separation of families, the extended family, in that younger people were leaving the old folks behind on the farm and going to the cities. He means separation of nuclear families, in that the father as wage earner is out of the house for so much of the day, or the father may have left the family on the farm and gone to the big city to make money to support them back home. He means mass immigration, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. The German and Irish immigrations were largely over by the end of the 19th century. He means child labor, inappropriate female labor. He means a rise in alcoholism, domestic abuse, petty crime, a loss of leisure, a loss of the ability to worship on Sundays because labor was demanded. And above all, the greatest degeneracy he sees is that suddenly everyone's value is being computed strictly on how much money they can make. This is the age in which secularism, socialism, and communism begin to be serious forces in European and North American history. Karl Marx died in 1883. The first volume of his work, Das Kapital, was published in 1867. Vladimir Lenin was jailed for political activity for the first time in 1893. We'll see him a little later on in 1917 during the Russian Revolution. Pope Leo feels called to respond to this new situation. How does he respond? This encyclical is interesting. The Holy Father recognizes these new realities of wage labor and the whole capitalist system behind it, although he never uses the word capitalism. But he does not either simply describe the situation in order to condemn it, or accept the situation in order to make some sort of peace with it. He surveys the whole landscape and brings to the discussion the particular viewpoint of the church, not primarily based on divine revelation, not primarily based on the teachings, the life, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, but rather on what Pope Benedict XVI, much more in our own time, is going to call the church's expertise in human nature. Who are we? We've inherited the whole tradition of Greek philosophy. We've inherited the whole moral tradition of the Old Testament. We've inherited the teaching of Jesus Christ and the example of Jesus Christ. We've inherited 2,000 years of prayer, meditation, experience with every form of government that's ever been, and especially with the insights that come from the monastic life, where men and women living in communities, living real lives together with their salvation, with participation in the life of the Holy Trinity, their primary goal. All of these experiences give the church a certain perspective. What Pope Leo does is begin from what we call in theology and philosophy natural law. Because the created world is as it is, because human beings are as we are, there are certain conclusions that can simply be drawn from the reality in which we live. And that's a philosophical fact. Human beings are human beings in fundamental ways across history and in every culture. From a Catholic perspective, we can even say why that is. That is because God has created the world with a certain order and created us at the center of that world with a particular mission, namely to oversee this creation according to God's will and to act out our own image and likeness relationship to God, and so come to share in his divine life forever. But for most of this encyclical, Pope Leo doesn't say much theological. He stays within the realm of what any observer of human reality would have to agree is true. And so the principles he focuses on are, first of all, the inherent dignity of every human being. Secondly, the inherent right, not just instinct, but right of every human person to seek to preserve his or her own life. Next, the fundamental centrality of the family as the original building block of society. Next, the right to private property as a consequence of the centrality of the family and as a consequence of the human person's right to self-preservation. Next, the fundamental right for human beings to associate, to interact with each other, to group together for a common good, for a common purpose. And finally, what is traditionally called distributive justice, that is, the moral obligation for each person to claim and receive what is due to each of us. We'll have to say more about that one later. Down the line, toward the end of the encyclical, Pope Leo will introduced some specifically Catholic principles, namely that the dignity of the human person is rooted in our image and likeness relationship to God. Secondly, that our primary goal in this life should be the attainment of eternal life. Thirdly, as a consequence of that, the centrality of the human person's need and obligation to worship, the dignity, but also the difficulty of labor as a consequence of original sin, the primary value of charity as a moral principle in all its forms, and the practice of virtue as an antidote to the social problems that Pope Leo sees growing in this new capitalistic economy. Let's take each of these in turn. Pope Leo chooses to begin by focusing on the family. The family is the first institution God founds when he commands Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. It's the oldest society in the world, Pope Leo says, and it requires the right to private property to support itself. We need a place to live. We need, in the simplest view of things, we need ground to work. We need tools with which to work them. And for various reasons, if we just stick to farming for a minute, we need to be able to store up from our abundance now in order to have in reserve for a bad year, for a bad season, for a bad crop. And moreover, Pope Leo sees that every father wants to ensure the success of his children to be able to survive beyond him. And all of these argue that amassing a reasonable amount of private property is necessary for the support of the family. And you can hear here that Pope Leo is taking specific aim at socialism for the first, but not for the last time. Now, obviously, in 1891, it is the Holy Father's vision that the husband goes out and works, the wife stays home and maintains the home and raises the children. That will color a few things in this encyclical, but it's interesting that nowhere in this encyclical is there any mention of public education. It was not a universal reality at the end of the 19th century in many places. It was an option. And in many places, what education happened in the home. That was certainly true of the rich, whose children were tutored privately in the home. And it was equally true of many poor people who learned to read, write, and count from other members of their family, and probably learned to read from a Bible or a prayer book. But Pope Leo says, it is a most sacred law of nature that a father should provide food and all necessities for those whom he has begotten, and that he should wish that his children should be provided by him with all that is needful to keep them from want, misery, and the uncertainties of this mortal life. Think how many social problems of our own day would simply be solved by stable families with working fathers, providing for the children they have begotten. Pope Leo goes on to say that the authority of the family is prior to any authority of the state. Paternal authority, he says, can never be abolished by the state. The state, what we would call the government, the state, Pope Leo reminds us, is subject to God. It neither assigns nor can take away natural rights. It is inferior to the family because it only comes into being casually by human choice, whereas the family is instituted by God. The state, governments, nations, tribes, whatever level of organization you want to talk about, Pope Leo reminds us, they're simply one expression of the natural human right and natural human tendency to organize ourselves into groups, to collaborate, to socialize. Human persons are social beings. The Greek philosophers knew that. Catholics know why. We are social beings because we are created in the image of a trinity of persons, a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, perfectly united in a sharing of life and love. The state's job, according to Pope Leo, is to oversee justice. And in an expression that became famous at the Second Vatican Council, but here it is in 1891, Pope Leo reminds us that the state has a special obligation toward the poor who have no other recourse. Rich people will always have money, connections, something to solve their problems. Very often the poor will have no one but the civil authority to defend them. The Second Vatican Council will talk about a preferential option for the poor, which is an obligation placed upon the church. Pope Leo repeats himself in number 35 of the encyclical when he says, the state must not absorb the individual or the family. Here again, he's poking at socialism, which sought to replace the family unit by some impersonal state organization and made the value of the individual far inferior to the value of the state. Pope Leo also expresses a basic principle that we will find throughout Catholic social teaching. It's so basic that it's shocking that it's not a word every Catholic knows. And that word is subsidiarity. Simply put, it means some larger level of organization should never arrogate to itself a function that can be performed at a smaller level. Most importantly, it means that the state cannot arrogate to itself that which properly belongs to the family. Pope Leo reminds us that human persons and human families precede the existence of any state. Just look in the book of Genesis and see when nations start appearing. It's rather long after Adam and Eve. It's long after trades begin to be established. The role of the state, Pope Leo says in number 32, is to enact laws that conform to reason and to natural law for the general well-being. Obvious enough. But then Leo says something interesting. He says, the more good the state does for the working class, the less need there will be to seek special means to relieve them. Simply put, the more the state works to create an equitable environment of labor, economics, and access to benefits, the less need there will be for special interventions like welfare. And so in number 36, Pope Leo says, the state should intervene for the interest of the community or of the individual. And it's interesting, the things he lists that the state should be protecting. The state should be protecting the family in its integrity, should be protecting religion, or at least the free practice of religion, and it should be protecting personal safety. In 1891, Pope Leo also has no problem saying that the state should also enact laws that protect morality. In 1891, most thinking people still believed in an absolute truth from which one could derive absolute moral principles, things that were values in every case. That's not at all true in what we call our pluralistic society today. But in 1891, it was still true. And so countries had on the books laws against things like adultery. Number 47 is very interesting. Because the right to private property precedes the existence of any state, Pope Leo says the state would therefore be unjust and cruel if, under the name of taxation, it were to deprive the private owner of more than is fair. Everybody from Jesus Christ himself has recognized the validity of states' rights to tax its citizens. But Leo says there is a limit to the amount of taxation that is legitimate. Now, because there's no discussion of public education in this document, and because there's, I think, only one mention of anything like healthcare, two of the most costly things in our tax bill today are never mentioned in this document. The way people accessed education and healthcare in 1891 was very different. And there's really no notice taken of just how many people probably had access to neither. From the point of view of education, the Holy Father presumed that the necessary education, the education in virtue, the education in a trade, the education in the practice of one's faith would happen in the home. Parents had skills they could teach their children that might have included reading and writing and arithmetic, but maybe not. But they had the skills they had to support themselves could be passed on to their children, along with the tools and the property with which to exercise those trades. So this is a gap in the document, and we can't blame Leo in 1891 for that. But it also kind of impacts anything we would say about taxation. Because in 1891, taxation would have supported the government, the army, and what public works there were, the building of roads, bridges, things like that. Number 34 is a very interesting statement by the Holy Father. Within the state, the Holy Father says, all citizens must contribute, but not all contribute in the same way. Leo insists again and again and again, contrary to the teachings of socialism, that absolute equality in a society is impossible. Inequalities will exist. They will exist on the level of personal ability and personal interest, not only on individual opportunities. Leo distinguishes leaders, the people we would call entrepreneurs or capitalists, from tradespeople, and again, them from wage earners. Leo recognizes that it's because of the particular abilities and the willingness to take a risk on the part of these industrialists that wage earners have a job at all. Leo says this as well on the subject of equality. Since the end of society is to make men better, the chief good that society can possess is virtue. Leo also notes in the same paragraph, it is only by the labor of working men that states grow rich. Justice therefore demands that the interests of the working classes should be carefully watched over, that they may themselves share in the benefits which they create, that being housed, clothed, and bodily fit, they may find their life less hard and more endurable. And this seems to be the list of the things that are due to every human person: food, clothing, shelter, bodily fitness, health. This is the foundation from which Pope Leo goes on to make specific recommendations for relations between workers and their employers. And I'm going to stop here because we're over 30 minutes already. I'm going to close this session and then open up another one because I'm on a roll. But I think most people's tolerance of listening to a guy on a screen is about 30 minutes. So I'm going to check out here and then come right back with a second broadcast. But there's something I didn't mention right at the start. This discussion of labor and the opportunities and the challenges it created at the turn of the 20th century is of particular importance to us here at St. Michael's. Rerum Novarum is May of 1891. St. Michael's was founded in November of 1890. Founded by whom? Founded by wage laborers who were arriving in Passaic in droves from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, attracted exactly by the opportunity for the money that could be made in wage-earning jobs here in the United States. The mills and the factories that used to surround this church, and to some degree still do, are exactly the places in which Pope Leo sees opportunity, but also real moral challenges. This question of the rights of workers is foundational to the history of this parish and was a reality in the lives of our founders. Glory to Jesus Christ.